Hi, everyone. Welcome to another day of our Aquarium Online Academy. My name is Sergio. I'm part of the education team here at the Aquarium of the Pacific. I'm coming to you live right now from Long Beach, California, where our wonderful aquarium is. And we're going to be talking about a lot of amazing animals. Now, a lot of the animals that we're going to talk about today, you might be able to find here at the aquarium if you come to visit us someday. But a lot of these ones you'll also just see around in various different parts of the ocean, and in fact the topic specifically, so not necessarily just the animals that we talk about, but the way that we're going to talk about these animals, the kind of bigger ideas that they connect us to today is going to be something that you can experience pretty much every second of the day, and that'll make a little bit more sense when we as we explore the idea. But that's going to be because today what we're going to talk about is the food web. Okay, what does that mean? Well, before we get in too deep, I do want to start off by saying that, again, this is a live program, so you can actually text us directly, or text me and my friend Sarah, who's kind of controlling all of the magic screen stuff going on behind me. And if you do want to text into that number, well, that's going to be the number that they put right there below, and that is 562-286-1838. So again, if you want to answer any of the questions, or if you have questions, I love answering questions. It keeps it going, kind of like if we were talking in real time. So if you have any of those questions, feel free to text at that number, okay? But of course, if you don't want to necessarily text along, you can always just answer the questions on your own in your room or with the people around you. And then, of course, if you're watching this video at a later time, meaning not right now at 10 a.m. on January 16th, 2024, Happy New Year's, then you can always email those questions to the email below that number right there. So that's live@lbaop.org. And so those are going to be the two ways that you can communicate with us. Now, jumping back into that topic of the day, I said we were going to be learning about food webs. Now, I do want to give everybody at home a chance to maybe tell me what you think that means. What is a food web? Is it an idea that you might have heard before? So I'll give you some chances to type in those kinds of responses, or even ask questions if you're not 100% sure what it might mean. Now, another kind of word that's very similar that we'll kind of break down the difference between, but another word that you might be familiar with is food chain. So instead of food web, some people are also more familiar with the term food chain. And they're connected and very similar, but they're not quite exactly the same thing. So these ideas of a food chain and a food web, they tell us about how, or it's kind of how humans understand the way that energy moves through an environment. Now, what does that mean? Okay, let's take a step back. If you think about everything that we do as humans, as animals, we're animals too, but even think about all the animals around us. It could be the fish swimming around me behind here on the screen. It could be a pet that you have at home, maybe a dog or a cat. These animals, and in fact other life forms on our earth, we run on energy. Think about how you feel on a day that maybe you haven't eaten breakfast, or maybe you haven't had your morning cup of coffee yet, right? If you're a coffee drinker, you haven't taken in that stuff that gives you energy. And we get our nutrients or our energy from what we take in. So usually things like food and water and other parts of our diet, right? Now, animals aren't any different either. And like I said, other life forms aren't either. Plants are a really important part of our earth, and they are actually part of this food web. So the food web and the food chain, that is basically just, it's all of the things that go into each other's diet. So it's what one animal eats, and then what eats that animal, or what one plant, we'll say eats for now before I explain it better, but we'll say what plant eats, and then what animal eats that plant. And whenever an animal eats something, eats either another plant or another animal, the energy that that animal or that plant got from one place, it actually goes to the whatever ate it next. So it creates this chain. So that's what a food chain is, right? So it's one thing eats something, and then it's like a plant maybe eats something, an animal eats that plant, and then another animal eats that, and you see you get this chain going along, where the energy from the start goes all the way to the last kind of animal doing the eating at the end. Now, a food web is like that, but a little bit bigger. We expand food webs a little bit wider because, of course, there's not just one thing that eats. We don't just eat one thing, right? And I don't just mean how some animals can eat plants and animals, but I mean how even what we would call carnivores, we'll explore that later, but what we call animals like carnivores, meaning they only eat meat, well, they could get their meat from a lot of different places. They could eat a lot of different animals, and in fact, they do, right? Animals can't afford to be that picky sometimes in their habitats, so they have to eat various things. So one animal, like a shark, let's say a great white shark, it could eat a couple different things, right? It could eat a seal. And maybe some days it doesn't catch a seal. Maybe some days it has to settle for some smaller fish, right? And so because of that, the food web, it expands out. So it's like a food chain, but with a lot of different branches kind of breaking off or branching off of it. And we'll explore that, okay? So I'm going to kind of step off screen here and talk to you because I want us to look at the video that's been playing on behind me. Now, this is from one of our here at the aquarium. It's called our Blue Cavern exhibit. It's modeled after a real place that's right off the coast of Catalina Island. So right near us here in Southern California at Long Beach. If you're watching from a little bit further away, then you might not necessarily be familiar with this environment, but what we call this is we call this a kelp forest. Now, this is actually a really great place to start our conversation about food webs and the traveling of energy in a habitat, because we actually can see examples of sort of the first two things that start pretty much every food chain. Now, we're going to be talking mostly about aquatic food webs or food chains. That's because, you know, we have a lot of great examples here at an aquarium about aquatic habitats, meaning underwater. But again, you can also think about food chains and food webs on land, which is maybe stuff that we might be a little bit more familiar with. But does anyone happen to know what every food web, no matter where you are on Earth, whether it's on land, in the water, in the sky, no matter what, every food web starts with the same thing? Does anybody have any guesses? I'll give you a hint. It's what plants eat. I said earlier, plants eat, even though that sounds kind of funny because we don't think of plants eating, but they do get energy. They take energy in. And they don't quite have mouths like we do. They don't have teeth and, you know, a stomach, and they don't chew their food and then break it all down in their stomach. They don't get their energy that way. They're actually able to make their own energy. It's a process that you might have heard before. It's called photosynthesis. If you haven't, don't worry, we'll kind of explain it a little bit. But it's how plants make their own energy. But in order to do it, they need one thing, and this is the one thing that starts every food chain. Any guesses or anyone know what I'm thinking about? Where do plants get their energy from? Let's see. Now, if we think about it, looking at this kelp here, so this over here, if you see these tall kind of structures, we're looking at it kind of from the top down, so it looks a little funky. But this actually gives really good, gives us a good way to start thinking about it, and it almost kind of gives us a hint to what I'm trying to get at. Because if you look at it, does it just flop all the way down at the bottom? The kelp, the seaweed? No, right? So the kelp, it actually floats to the top to where, so that's why it kind of looks like it's closer to us in this video. But that kelp floats all the way to the top. Now it actually has these things called little air bladders, and so they're actually, if you've ever seen kelp or seaweed, especially if you're local to Southern California, you probably see it a lot washed up on the beach, and those little kind of bubbles that are at the base of them, they're little bubbles full of air. I don't know if you've ever popped them, but I always pop them. But they have a little bit of air in them, and that's actually to help them float up towards the top of the water. This is a great video here. I'm going to step off so that you guys can see that better. But this is a great example. So all the air in those little bubbles, kind of like right around there, see those little bubbles? Those air bladders, that helps the kelp stay floating. And why do you think they might want to be towards the surface of the water and not down at the bottom? You can actually see the answers in this video. That's why I love this video. But look at all those beams of what? Yeah, those beams of light. And where's that light coming from? Do you think there's somebody up there like holding a flashlight like, hello? No, right? It's the sun. Yes, the sun. So the start of every food web on Earth is the sun. Absolutely. Now, it's kind of weird to think, right? Because we don't think about eating the sun very much, but that's what plants do. That's what photosynthesis is they use sunlight, they use the energy from the sunlight in order to make their own sugars. So it's kind of like if you've ever seen like a fireplace kind of burning, the way that the wood is fuel for the fire. Well, the sunlight is fuel for plants. And now, more specifically, now on land, plants is usually what we're seeing. So things like trees, flowers, grasses, right? Those kinds of plants are what are usually the second in the food chain. We call those producers because there's the ones that are producing or making their own food. But again, the ocean is a little bit different. Now, you don't see a lot of plants the same way that you do on the surface down in the ocean. In fact, one of the most abundant, the kind of most important producers that you see in the ocean is algae. And that's actually what this kelp is. Now, algae is kind of like plants. There are a lot of similarities, but they're not exactly the same. That's why they do have different names and why we don't quite call them, treat them the same way. So algae doesn't usually always have all the structures that other plants do. So you don't always see things like roots, stems, or even leaves in the same way. And kelp's a great example of that. It kind of has parts that look a little bit like all of that, but they're not the same. So it doesn't have roots, but it does kind of have a structure at the end that looks like roots, but it's called a holdfast, and that's used just to hold it in place. It also, you might have seen those blades. Now, they look like leaves. We call them blades because they're not exactly the same as those, as the leaf of a plant you might be used to seeing on the surface. But so they are different. And kelp is actually that largest algae. But I want to show you if we can kind of go to my document camera over here, so I could show you an example of something I have in my hands here. We also have what we call phytoplankton. Let's see, I hope you can read that well there. So phytoplankton. So phytoplankton is the other big algae that we're going to have in our food web in the ocean. And so this is one of the most common producers that you see in the ocean. Well, actually, I should change my wording there because you probably won't see this very much. Now, algae, like these phytoplankton, if you just kind of block off that phyto part, you get plankton. Now, if you're a fan of a certain Nickelodeon show like I am, you might be used to plankton. And actually, we could probably see, let's see if we have one, probably be on the other side. I'll point it out later. But if we plankton isn't just one thing. It's not just one organism. It can be a lot of different ones. That's why you see a lot of different options here. And in fact, if we were to take like a scoop of ocean water right from the harbor here and put it under a microscope, you actually would be able to find a lot of these little organisms here, these phytoplankton. And that's because they're microscopic little organisms, and they are producing photosynthesis. So they're doing photosynthesis. They're photosynthesizing just like the kelp is. So just like plants do, so they are an algae, just like plants do on the surface, they take in energy. So they become that kind of second stage of the food web. But then what eats them? Well, if we flip this over, we get the first kind of consumers, the first set of consumers. So if we said that plants and algae are producers because they produce their own energy, well, then any animal or any organism that eats to get its own energy, so it doesn't make its own energy but has to eat something from the outside and take it into its body, then that is called a consumer. If you think about it, it's because they're consuming energy. They're eating food, right? Consumption is just another word for kind of eating or taking in. And so these zooplankton, these are the very first consumers that you find in an ocean food web. Now, yes, I did just flip the paper over, and it's just kind of seems like they have a lot of overlap, right? Phytoplankton, zooplankton, and that's because they do. They're both planktonic organisms, meaning they're usually pretty small. Now, a lot of the time, from being here at the aquarium a little while, the thing that I find that most people kind of think is that plankton has to be small, right? Because plankton must be small animals. And in fact, I mean, what we've been talking about today kind of supports that, right? All of these zooplankton and phytoplankton that we were looking at, they're very tiny organisms. But actually, the real definition of plankton is anything that can't swim against the ocean current on its own. So anything that doesn't have the power, any organism that doesn't have the power to swim against an ocean current. That means the kind of the motions of the water flowing naturally. And so, of course, if we think about it, these tiny little organisms, that makes sense that they can't quite, that they count as plankton because they're so small and the strength of the waves can be so much more than they're able to. And so then, let's see. Okay, so I'm seeing that we have some questions. Let's try to answer some. Is it true? So someone asked, is it true that most of the Earth's air is produced by algae? Now that's an awesome question. Yes, absolutely. So if we go back kind of to the other side here, this phytoplankton. So everybody, if you're at home, you can do this with me. Let's kind of come onto the screen, do it with you. Let's all take a deep breath in. And then breathe out. That's right. So you just breathed in air, right? Oxygen. And so you can thank these guys for them. These little phytoplankton and that kelp that we saw earlier. Things like these little guys here, right? This kelp is an artificial kelp, but it gets the job done. But you can thank them for that. I don't quite exactly remember the exact statistic, but I want to say it's almost around like 70 or 80% of a lot of the oxygen in the air comes from these ocean algae. So phytoplankton and things like kelp too. They're what help make an environment really, really rich. And so that also kind of brings us to why we want to help protect these habitats too, right? Sometimes because they're underwater and kind of away from our eyes, we don't think about them as much, but they're really, really, really important. Let's see, what other questions did we have? Let me answer one more. Can a plant make too much sugar? Ooh, interesting. I don't know if a plant can make too much sugar and become like sick the way that a human might. That's a great question. I'll have to look that up. I want to say my instincts tell me no, because I would think that unless that there's some sort of like mutation or something wrong, like going wrong. I want to say that like most organisms, they're usually built to survive, so their bodies, try to keep in balance. But of course, sometimes outside factors or things kind of going wrong can get in the way of that. But that's a really interesting question. Okay, but thinking back to these phytoplankton here, or actually going back to our zooplankton, these are usually, again, so zooplankton are different than phytoplankton because phytoplankton are algae. So they're essentially plants. And now zooplankton are animals. So they are living animals. Most of the time, they are actually baby animals. So if you look down here on there, the one that says Medusa there, those ones are usually going to be those young jellies, things like jellies. So sea jellies, but also a lot of invertebrates, meaning animals in the ocean without bones or backbones. So things like crabs, shrimp, a lot of those smaller kind of creatures that you see, those are going to usually start out as plankton. Going back to that, to SpongeBob, thinking of that, the copepod here, that's actually probably, I would say, the most famous zooplankton because it's what the character Plankton from SpongeBob is actually based off of. You can see the little shape there. It's got that oval shape with the two long antennas, and it even's got that one eye. Now, in reality, that's what we call an eye spot, so it doesn't quite see like we do. It could just see the difference between light and dark, but it is an option there. And so that is an example of the first wave, if you will, of consumers in a food web. But now, let's look at an example of one of these consumers a little bit closer. So this is what we call krill. And now you might have heard, now this is some krill that's preserved. Let's see if it'll kind of even out a bit. There we go. Perfect. Okay, so here is, it's kind of like some krill that's been preserved. So you can see really good, so their faces are kind of there, their eyes are there. And they're basically like a small kind of shrimp, essentially. And now, does anyone know what animals really like eating krills? Now, of course, thinking about our food web, these krill are consumers in themselves, right? They consume usually those phytoplankton. So they're pretty small on their own, so they're not going out and hunting, a big a sea lion or something. But they are consumers, and they're going to be kind of like the second or that first wave of consumers because they're small, and so they're also going to be eating those smaller phytoplankton in the ocean. But then there's actually another kind of wave of consumers after that, and they eat something like this. And now you might think they're going to be small because, well, this is a small animal and it eats small phytoplankton. So the thing that eats this krill must be really small too, right? Well, I don't know about that. Let's see if I have an example of, do we have stuffy? Let's see. Okay, so what are we? Oh, there's even one on the screen. Perfect. But good. A whale. Now, I guess the stuffy doesn't do justice to its size, but the picture does, right? Let's step off over here. So if you see over here, a whale. That's right. Whales love to eat krill. This little krill here. This is perfect. See? So the krill and whales, they go hand in hand. They love to eat krill. So whales love to eat krill, even though they're so huge. So you can imagine that its role as a consumer of this krill, it has a lot of work to do because it has to eat a lot of krill in order to actually be able to sustain itself. Ooh, let's see. Do we got a video? Wonderful. So I think this one is going to be coming up for a scoop of krill. And I say scoop because we'll see quite how it does it. Ooh, it looks like it maybe just got done feeding. So usually, so you saw a little example of that blowhole there. If we've ever seen, let's see, I don't know if we have a photo of, or even a video where we can see the inside of a whale's mouth. Let's see. But if we do, we'll look at that in a second here. For right now, if we look at our document camera here, this is actually how these whales, as consumers, are going to be eating that krill. Now this here is called baleen. Okay, so whales can be broken up into two groups. There's the baleen whales, and that's like that humpback, blue whale, gray whale, a lot of those whales that we saw. And then there's toothed whales, and that's going to be things like orcas, right? So like killer whales or sperm whales, and those are ones that have hard teeth, kind of like ours. So this, for example, is an example of an orca tooth or a killer whale. It's an example of one of their teeth. But you're not going to find in the mouth of a blue whale or a gray whale or a humpback, you're not going to find any teeth like this. Instead, what you're going to find is this, and it's called baleen. And this is real life baleen here. The main thing to know about it is it's very similar. You actually could feel your fingernails, and if you feel your fingernails, that's actually very similar to the feeling of this baleen right now that I'm touching and holding. That's because they're made out of the same kind of the same type of like little hairs, little fibers. If you ever, I don't know me, but I don't know about you, but I used to have a really bad habit of biting my fingernails. And if you ever bite them, you know, they kind of break off into those little hair pieces, essentially. Well, that's essentially what baleen is as well. And you can even see it on here. So some parts of it have kind of hardened over time, but this hair-like piece is there. That's what most of it looks like. And it might be a little bit harder at the front, but then, or in the back of its baleen. But really, it's this hair-like structure. And what that does is, if you've ever kind of used like a broom, it helps trap all those little bits, all those little krill. So basically, that whale will take in a bunch of water in through its mouth, and as it kind of pushes the water out of its mouth, so essentially like spitting the water back out, all the little krill there get stuck in these little hairs, like if it was dust in a broom. The hair traps the little krill, and then the whales do something that I just think is really cute and really funny. But they'll just kind of lick the rims of their mouth and lick all the little krills out of the little hair there, out of the little baleen, and then they'll eat their food. And they have to do that a lot in order to catch a lot of krill. But that is their job there as a consumer. Yeah, it's pretty cool. So if we look at that, so we take a step back from there, let's see. Do we got a whale? Oh, this is awesome. So if you see over here, right there inside of the mouth there, that's a great example of that baleen. So you can see it looks a lot more like that kind of hair material, right, that we were talking about, that we saw in the example over on my document camera. But there's that baleen. And so imagine water going in and trying to come back out, but the hard parts, the krill essentially, is going to be trapped in there, and that's how they catch their food. Now, we can think about this idea of our food web and expand it out to other animals in the ocean, right? Remember, I said it's called a food web, not just a food chain, because the food web branches out into a bunch of little places and a bunch of different branches. And we can even think about that krill or those zooplankton, right? Zooplankton and phytoplankton, there's a lot of them. They're so tiny. Like I said, if we took a scoop of water, we would actually find lots of them in that water. In this environment here, I'll actually step off here and we can kind of do this together. Let's kind of try to imagine or put together the food web here. So let's see, the start of the food web, let's see who remembers, where would our food web in this habitat here start? And just to give you a little hint, this is another example of a kelp forest. So let's see, if you remember from the start of our time together, where would our food web start? Now, if you said the sun, yes, good job. Very, very good. So it's going to start outside of the ocean entirely, outside of our planet, actually, really, if you think about it. And that food web starts with the sun. So the sunlight beams down, right? And yes, the kelp that you see here, this wonderful giant kelp there, that is going to be one of the producers, right? We call that a producer because they're producing energy. They're using the sunlight to make energy. And then they are making their own from that. And so they're producers, but also in this water is all of those tiny little phytoplankton, the algae that's freely floating in the water. And then, so those are our producers. Then we can identify some kind of first level consumers, if you will. Now, again, we're not going to see them too much because they're also on a microscopic scale, but that's all the zooplankton that's floating around in here. Now, again, that zooplankton might be things like young crabs, young shrimp, even young fish. One of my favorite facts is that if you know the largest bony fish, one of the largest bony fish, it's called the mola mola or the sunfish. And that animal, the mola mola, actually starts out as a tiny little, like microscopic little zooplankton until it grows larger. So even one of the largest animals can be considered a plankton at one point in its life. So all of those zooplankton that make up that water or are in that water are going to be part of that kind of first wave of consumers. But then what might eat them? Now, we don't have any whales in here, right? So maybe that krill whale discussion we had might not apply here. But what else might be eating those zooplankton? Well, things like our fish. The fish here that you see, a lot of these rockfish, they're going to be eating those small zooplankton when they get usually a little bit larger. So when they're maybe not when they're fully tiny, but remember I said a lot of that zooplankton is things like young animals. So when they start to get a little bit larger, they'll eat those as well. And let's see, we said somebody asked a question. Somebody asked a really good question. They said, how does studying these cycles help us to understand natural processes? I really love that question because actually the food webs and the way that energy kind of moves throughout nature is one of my favorite things that I studied when I was in college and really even studying now, working here. It's something that I just love thinking about all the time because if you think about it, it's something that connects, that helps keep us connected to everything. A lot of the times it's very easy for us to not necessarily feel too connected to the natural world. And that makes sense. There's a lot of differences between us and a lot of these animals, like these fish, right? It's maybe hard to connect to them sometimes. We don't quite always look like these fish, or we don't interact the same way they do. We can't breathe underwater. They live in a whole different environment. But when we really step aside, when we kind of look at the bigger picture, this flow of energy, it literally connects us. So because of the way that these food webs work, it affects the nutrients that we get. Fish is actually, the ocean is a really great example of this. So some of you, if you might have heard of this about this a little bit, but with fish, metals in their body is actually a really big problem, not just for them, but even for us as humans who eat fish, right? And actually seafood is a really, really sustainable form of food, especially for us as humans. It actually, if we ate more seafood, it would help us to kind of lower things like carbon emissions and have a healthier planet in general. But we have to do that in balance because sometimes, because of different human activity, things like different chemicals and different metals, specifically mercury is a big one, that one gets into the water, and the tiny little zooplankton or phytoplankton will take those metals in. And it looks like it's just a tiny bit. It's not a lot. It's not like they're eating, a bar of metal, but it's just a tiny bit. But if enough of them do that, then when one fish eats those little zooplankton, then they get a lot of that metal built into them because, right, they're going to have to eat a lot of them. Think of that whale that had to eat so much krill. So those animals are going to be eating that. And then when we eat that fish, well, guess where that metal goes? It doesn't just disappear into the air. It goes into us, and that can actually be pretty bad for us. And the same applies to other animals. So a sea lion that might be eating one of these other animals, that affects it too. So these food webs, food doesn't just go away when after we eat it. It actually carries on from the very start of the food web to the end. If you really think about it, and I'll end us here because I think this is a really wonderful place to end. But if you really think about it, there's a little bit of sunlight in literally all of us right now because the producers that ate, or if you will, that ate or took in that sunlight to create their own energy to photosynthesize, well, something had to eat them. And whatever you ate this morning or whatever you're going to eat later today had to have eaten a producer. And then you ate it. Or maybe you went straight to the producer and had a nice bowl of broccoli or something. But either way, you took in that energy as well. And so the nutrients that it pulled from the sunlight that it made are now in you, and that's going to be going passed on throughout this entire food web. And when we remember that, it actually helps us stay connected to these natural processes even better and helps us to really understand why even in faraway habitats, something that's happening on one side of the earth can affect something that's going on the completely other side. But okay, I want to thank you guys so much for all of your wonderful questions and interactions. I saw that Sarah was doing a lot of typing, so it sounds like we probably had a lot of questions, which I love. Sorry if we didn't get to fully answer them, but I hope that maybe she typed some answers there for you. But again, thank you so much. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day and have a lovely time. We will see you again for another Aquarium Online Academy next week. Thank you, guys.